prelude to the storm, setting the stage. Picture, if you will, the amber light of dawn breaking across the English countryside on September 17, 1944. Across dozens of airfields stretching from the Midlands to East Anglia, the throaty rumble of aircraft engines mingles with the morning mist. C-47 Dakotas and Sterling bombers sit heavy on the tarmac, their olive-drab fuselages pregnant with the hopes of a war-weary world. Inside these aircraft, 20,000 paratroopers check their equipment one final time, their faces a mixture of determination and the quiet resignation that comes before great undertakings. This is the morning of Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in military history and perhaps the most audacious gamble of the Second World War. But to understand why these men are about to leap into the Dutch sky, we must first step back and examine the chessboard of Europe as it appeared in those early autumn days of 1944. The great Allied breakout from Normandy had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. What had begun as a grinding battle of attrition in the hedgerows of Calvados had transformed into a headlong pursuit across France. Paris had fallen on August 25th, Brussels followed on September the 2nd. Antwerp, that crucial port, was liberated the very next day. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as though the war might end before Christmas. Yet beneath this veneer of triumph, a more complex reality was emerging. The very speed of the Allied advance had created its own problems. Supply lines stretched like rubber bands across hundreds of miles of liberated territory. Fuel trucks raced to keep pace with armored spearheads that had outrun their logistics. Ammunition dumps lay hundreds of miles behind the advancing armies. The great port of Cherbourg, though captured, remained partially blocked by German demolitions. The mathematics of modern warfare were reasserting themselves with cold precision. General Omar Bradley would later describe this period as the tyranny of distance. His First Army had advanced over 400 miles in less than a month. Patton's Third Army had covered even more ground, their Sherman tanks now sitting silent not from enemy action, but from empty fuel tanks. The great Allied war machine, so carefully orchestrated for the Normandy landings, was beginning to show the strain of its own success. It was against this backdrop that Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery conceived what would become Operation Market Garden. Montgomery, that most methodical of commanders, found himself in an unusual position. Throughout the campaign in North Africa and Sicily, he had been criticized for his cautious approach, his methodical set-piece battles, his reluctance to exploit breakthrough opportunities. Now, with the German army apparently in full retreat, he proposed something that seemed entirely out of character, a single concentrated thrust deep into the heart of occupied Europe. The strategic logic was compelling. Ahead of the Allied armies lay the Siegfried Line, that formidable belt of fortifications that the Germans had spent years perfecting along their western frontier. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces were already beginning to consolidate behind these defenses. Every day of delay would allow the Wehrmacht more time to organize, more time to bring up reserves, more time to transform what appeared to be a rout into an organized defense. Montgomery's solution was elegant in its audacity. Rather than assault the Siegfried Line directly, why not simply bypass it entirely? A narrow corridor punched through the Netherlands could outflank the entire German defensive system. More importantly, it could secure the approaches to the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Capture the Ruhr, Montgomery argued, and the war would be over in a matter of weeks. The plan that emerged from Montgomery's headquarters was breathtaking in its scope and complexity. 3.5 airborne divisions would seize a series of bridges along a single highway stretching from the Dutch border to the Rhine. The American 101st Airborne would take the southernmost objectives around Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne would secure the bridges at Nijmegen, including the crucial crossing over the Vaal River. Furthest north, the British 1st Airborne Division would capture the prize, the bridge at Arnhem, gateway to the German heartland. Meanwhile, the British KEX Corps would launch a ground offensive along this same highway, linking up with each airborne division in turn. It was a plan that required clockwork precision, perfect timing, and more than a little luck. The paratroopers would have to hold their objectives until the ground forces could reach them. Any significant delay, any unforeseen complication, could leave thousands of elite troops isolated deep behind enemy lines. The briefings that took place across England in those first weeks of September painted an optimistic picture. Intelligence assessments suggested that German resistance would be minimal. The units facing XXX Corps appeared to be little more than demoralized remnants. In the target areas themselves, reconnaissance flights reported only scattered defensive positions. Most encouraging of all, there seemed to be virtually no German armor in the vicinity of the proposed landing zones. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, remembered the mood at these briefings as almost festive. "We were told this would be the final blow," he would later recall. "The Germans were finished. We would drop, take our objectives, and be home in time for tea." Similar optimism pervaded the American briefings. The 101st Airborne, veterans of Normandy, approached their assignment with the confidence of seasoned professionals. The 82nd Airborne, the All-American Division, had already proven themselves in Sicily, Italy, and France. Yet even as these preparations proceeded, there were those who harbored doubts. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding the British 1st Airborne Division, was troubled by several aspects of the plan. The drop zones assigned to his division were unusually far from their primary objective, nearly 8 miles from the Arnhem Bridge. This distance had been dictated by concerns about German flak positions, but it meant his troops would have to fight their way through the town itself to reach their target. More troubling still was the question of lift capacity. The RAF and USAF could not transport all 3 divisions simultaneously. The operation would require multiple lifts over several days, meaning that many units would go into action at only partial strength. For a division like the 1st Airborne, which had been training for 3 years but had never seen combat as a complete formation, this represented a significant handicap. Intelligence, too, was beginning to present a more complex picture than the initial briefings had suggested. Photo reconnaissance flights over the Arnhem area had detected what appeared to be German tanks in the Diehl area, just north of the city. When these photographs were brought to the attention of planning staff, they were dismissed as obsolete equipment, probably unserviceable. The prevailing wisdom held that the Germans had neither the fuel nor the personnel to operate armored formations so far from the front lines. This assessment would prove to be catastrophically wrong. Unknown to Allied intelligence, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions had been withdrawn to the Netherlands for rest and refitting after their mauling in the Falaise pocket. These were not the demoralized conscripts and old men that populated so many German units in the autumn of 1944. These were veteran Waffen-SS formations, commanded by experienced officers and equipped with some of the most advanced armor in the German inventory. Even more significantly, the divisions were under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich, one of the most capable tactical commanders in the German army. Bittrich had been expecting an Allied airborne operation for weeks. The pattern of reconnaissance flights, the movement of transport aircraft to forward bases, the increased radio traffic, all pointed to a major operation in the making. When the first paratroopers began dropping on the morning of September 17th, Bittrich was ready. But on this crisp September morning, as 20,000 Allied paratroopers made their final preparations, such concerns seemed distant and abstract. The great armada of transport aircraft stretched across the English countryside represented the finest military formations the Western Allies could field. The 1st Airborne Division, though untested as a complete unit, contained some of the most elite troops in the British Army. The American divisions had proven themselves time and again since D-Day. As the morning sun climbed higher, the sound of aircraft engines began to build to a crescendo. One by one, the great formations lifted off from their bases and began forming up over the English countryside. The sight was magnificent. Hundreds of aircraft stretching from horizon to horizon, their silver wings catching the morning light. Gliders filled with jeeps, anti-tank guns, and supplies followed in their wake, towed by Halifax and Stirling bombers. Inside the aircraft, the paratroopers settled in for the flight across the North Sea. Many had been through this routine before, but the scale of this operation was unlike anything they had experienced. Through the small windows of their transports, they could see other aircraft formations stretching in all directions. This was power made manifest. The industrial might of the Allied nations focused on a single objective. The mood among the troops was a mixture of anticipation and professional calm. These were veteran soldiers who understood their trade. They checked their weapons, adjusted their equipment, and settled into the familiar routine of waiting that defines so much of military life. Some dozed fitfully, others wrote letters that might never be sent. A few played cards or shared cigarettes. As the great aerial armada crossed the North Sea and approached the Dutch coast, the die was cast. In a few short hours, the fate of Operation Market Garden, and perhaps the war itself, would be decided in the streets and fields of the Netherlands. The stage was set for 9 days that would test the limits of human courage and reveal the razor-thin margin between triumph and disaster in modern warfare. Daybreak over Holland, airborne assault. The first C-47 Skytrains crossed the Dutch coast at precisely 1400 hours, their olive-drab fuselages cutting through scattered clouds that drifted like cotton across an azure September sky. Below them, the Netherlands stretched out in a patchwork of green fields and silver waterways, a landscape so peaceful it seemed impossible that it would soon become a battlefield. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost of the 2nd Parachute Battalion checked his watch one final time as his aircraft approached the drop zone near Arnhem. Through the small window, he could see the Nederrhein glinting in the afternoon sunlight, its banks lined with the neat gardens and red-tiled roofs of Dutch homes. Somewhere beyond those peaceful suburbs lay his objective, the road bridge that Montgomery's planners had deemed essential to the success of Market Garden. The green light flashed. Go, go, go! One by one, the paratroopers hurled themselves into the void, their olive canopies blossoming against the clear sky like deadly flowers. From farmhouses below, Dutch civilians emerged to witness this extraordinary sight. Hundreds, then thousands of Allied soldiers descending from the heavens. Children pointed skyward in wonder, while their parents wept with joy, believing that liberation had finally arrived. But Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, commanding the 1st Allied Airborne Army, from his glider high above the chaos, felt a growing unease as he surveyed the drop zones through his binoculars. The intelligence reports had promised light resistance, scattered German units retreating toward the fatherland. Yet even from this altitude, he could see movement in the tree lines that suggested something more organized, more dangerous. Near Eindhoven, the American 101st Airborne Division touched down in relatively good order. Major General Maxwell Taylor's paratroopers quickly assembled and began their advance toward the town's vital bridges. The Dutch countryside here was flat and open, crossed by narrow roads elevated above the marshy ground. Perfect terrain for defense if the Germans chose to make a stand. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed hard in a potato field, his equipment scattered by the impact. As he gathered his gear, he could hear the distinctive crack of Mauser rifles in the distance. The sound was sporadic at first, individual shots from nervous sentries, but within minutes it had grown into the sustained rattle of machine gun fire. So much for light resistance, Morrison muttered, checking his Thompson submachine gun as his squad formed up around him. Through the hedgerows ahead, smoke was already beginning to rise from the direction of Eindhoven. 40 miles to the north, the situation at Arnhem was developing along more ominous lines. The 1st British Airborne Division had been forced to land on drop zones nearly 8 miles from their primary objective, a compromise dictated by concerns about German flak positions that would soon prove tragically misguided. As Frost's battalion began its march toward the bridge, they moved through suburbs where the very silence seemed threatening. The houses here stood empty, their windows dark. Occasionally, a lace curtain would twitch as hidden residents peered out at the passing soldiers. But the joyful reception they had expected was notably absent. The local Dutch resistance had tried to warn the British that German forces in the area were far stronger than Allied intelligence suggested, but their messages had been dismissed or lost in the fog of war. At Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne Division under Brigadier General James Gavin faced perhaps the most complex mission of all. Their objectives included not only the massive road bridge over the Vaal River, but also the crucial high ground of the Groesbeek Heights. From these wooded hills, German artillery could dominate the entire corridor that XXX Corps would need to traverse. Captain Robert Murphy of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed in an apple orchard just as the church bells of Nijmegen began to toll 3 o'clock. The sound carried across the peaceful landscape with haunting clarity, marking the moment when Operation Market Garden truly began. But as Murphy oriented himself and began moving toward his rally point, he could already hear the rumble of tracked vehicles in the distance. Unknown to the Allied planners, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions had been refitting in the very areas chosen for the airborne assault. These were not the demoralized garrison troops described in intelligence briefings, but veteran formations commanded by officers who understood the strategic importance of the bridges they were meant to defend. SS Oberfuhrer Walter Harzer, commanding the 9th SS Panzer Division, had been conducting a routine inspection of his units when the first Allied transports appeared on the horizon. Within minutes, he was issuing orders that would transform a peaceful Sunday afternoon into a crucible of modern warfare. All units to immediate readiness, Harzer commanded from his headquarters in the woods near Arnhem. The enemy has revealed his intentions. We must not allow him to succeed. As the afternoon wore on, the sounds of battle began to echo across the Dutch countryside. In Eindhoven, American paratroopers engaged German defenders in fierce street fighting, moving from house to house in a deadly game of urban warfare. The civilians who had emerged to welcome their liberators now huddled in cellars as bullets shattered windows and mortar rounds cratered the cobblestone streets. Near Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne quickly discovered that their intelligence maps were woefully inadequate. The terrain was more heavily wooded than expected, crisscrossed by deep ravines and boggy streams that channeled their advance into predictable routes. German machine gun teams, hastily positioned but expertly sighted, turned each crossroads into a killing ground. But it was at Arnhem that the true scope of the intelligence failure became apparent. As Frost's battalion approached the outskirts of the city, they encountered not scattered resistance, but coordinated counterattacks supported by armored vehicles. The distinctive whine of Panzerfaust rockets began to punctuate the afternoon air, and the smoke of burning buildings started to drift across the ancient city. Lieutenant Tony Hibbert, serving as Frost's intelligence officer, found himself revising his estimates with each passing hour. The radio reports filtering back to divisional headquarters painted a picture far different from the swift advance that Market Garden required. Instead of lightly held positions, they were encountering prepared defenses. Instead of demoralized troops, they faced determined veterans who knew exactly what they were fighting for. As evening approached, the 3 airborne divisions found themselves engaged in battles that would determine not just their own fate, but the entire trajectory of the war in Western Europe. The bridges that seemed so attainable on the planning maps now appeared as distant objectives, defended by an enemy who had been underestimated at every level. In London, Montgomery's staff waited for reports of success that would never come. In the Dutch countryside, thousands of Allied soldiers prepared for a night of fighting in hostile territory, cut off from reinforcement and dependent entirely on their own courage and skill. The sun was setting over Holland, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to foreshadow the blood that would soon stain the peaceful fields and quiet streets of this ancient land. The road to Nijmegen, a slow grind. As dawn broke on September 18th, the second day of Market Garden, the reality of Montgomery's ambitious timeline began to crumble like morning mist before the harsh sun of German resistance. The ground component of the operation, XXX Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, had been scheduled to reach Eindhoven by nightfall of the first day, a goal that now seemed almost laughably optimistic as his lead tanks still struggled through the narrow Dutch countryside, barely 20 miles from their starting positions. The Irish Guards' armoured group, spearheading the advance, found themselves channeled along a single elevated road that the Dutch called Hell's Highway, though they had christened it that name long before British tanks began their tortuous journey northward. The terrain itself seemed designed by nature to frustrate military movement. On either side of the narrow causeway stretched vast expanses of soft polderland, reclaimed from the sea and crisscrossed with drainage ditches that could swallow a Sherman tank whole. General Kurt Student, the architect of Germany's airborne forces and now commanding Army Group H, had recognized this geographic reality immediately. From his headquarters, he issued orders that demonstrated the tactical acumen that had made him legendary among German paratroopers. Rather than attempt to hold every position, Student orchestrated a defense in depth, allowing the British to advance, then striking at their flanks and supply lines when they were most vulnerable and overextended. The German strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Every bridge became a potential choke point. Every farmhouse could conceal an anti-tank gun. Every bend in the road might hide a carefully positioned Panzerfaust team, ready to disable the lead vehicle and bring the entire column to a grinding halt. Student understood that he didn't need to destroy XXEX Corps entirely. He merely needed to delay them long enough for his forces to eliminate the isolated airborne divisions one by one. As the morning progressed, the sound of tank engines mixed with the distant rumble of artillery created a mechanical symphony that echoed across the flat Dutch landscape. The crews of the Sherman Fireflies and Cromwell tanks could feel the weight of time pressing against them as heavily as their steel armor. Every minute of delay meant another minute that the paratroopers at Arnhem fought alone against increasing odds. The advance guard encountered their first serious opposition at Valkenswaard, where German paratroopers, students' own men, had established defensive positions among the red brick houses and narrow streets. These were not the second-rate garrison troops that Allied intelligence had predicted. These were veterans of Crete and the Eastern Front, men who understood urban warfare with deadly precision. The battle for Valkenswaard became a house-to-house affair that consumed precious hours. British infantry, supported by tank fire, cleared each building methodically, while German defenders fell back from position to position, extracting maximum delay from every street corner and garden wall. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with dust from shattered masonry as the small Dutch town became another casualty of strategic ambition. By afternoon, when XXX Corps finally broke through Valkenswaard's defenses, they were already 12 hours behind Montgomery's optimistic schedule. The column stretched for miles behind them, a steel serpent crawling northward through countryside that seemed to grow more hostile with each passing kilometer. Radio communications crackled with increasingly urgent reports from the airborne divisions. Ammunition running low, casualties mounting, German counterattacks intensifying. The psychological weight of these delays began to settle over the advancing forces like a heavy blanket. Tank commanders, peering through their periscopes at the endless flat terrain ahead, could sense that something fundamental had gone wrong with the operation's timing. The blitzkrieg advance that Montgomery had envisioned was becoming a grinding slog through determined resistance. At Sun, just south of Eindhoven, the 101st Airborne had managed to secure a crossing over the Wilhelmina Canal, but only after the Germans had demolished the original bridge. American engineers worked frantically to construct a Bailey Bridge, while German artillery, guided by observers hidden in the surrounding countryside, dropped shells with methodical precision around the construction site. When the first British tanks finally rumbled across the makeshift span at Son, the sound of steel on steel seemed almost mournful. A mechanical dirge for the swift victory that was already slipping away. The tank crews could see the strain in the faces of the American paratroopers who had held this vital crossing point. These men had been fighting for over 24 hours with limited ammunition and no prospect of immediate relief. The liberation of Eindhoven brought brief moments of joy as Dutch civilians emerged from their homes, offering flowers and kisses to the advancing British soldiers. But even these celebrations carried an undertone of desperation. The local resistance fighters brought reports of massive German reinforcements moving toward Arnhem, and of increasing pressure on the isolated British paratroopers holding the northern end of the bridge. General Horrocks, monitoring the advance from his command vehicle, felt the weight of command settling heavily on his shoulders. A veteran of North Africa and Normandy, he understood battlefield tempo better than most commanders, and he could feel that Market Garden was losing its rhythm. Each delay compounded the next. Each obstacle consumed time that the operation simply didn't have. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Dutch countryside as XXX Corps continued its methodical advance toward Nijmegen. The Vaal River crossing loomed ahead like a strategic mountain that had to be climbed, defended by German forces that were growing stronger with each passing hour. Intelligence reports spoke of SS units, of anti-aircraft guns repositioned for ground defense, of an enemy that was no longer surprised or unprepared. In their foxholes and defensive positions around Arnhem, the men of the 1st Airborne Division could hear the distant rumble of artillery from the south, the sound of XXX Corps fighting its way northward. But that sound seemed to grow no closer, trapped as it was behind the network of waterways and defensive positions that Student had so skillfully prepared. The German general had studied the Allied operational pattern in Normandy and across France. He understood that their strength lay in rapid movement and overwhelming firepower. But the Dutch terrain negated both advantages. Here, in this maze of rivers and polders, the battle would be won by patience and tactical skill rather than by the industrial might that had carried the Allies across Western Europe. As evening approached on this second day of Market Garden, the true nature of the operation was becoming clear to commanders on both sides. This would not be the swift stroke that Montgomery had envisioned, but rather a grinding test of endurance between forces that were more evenly matched than anyone had dared to imagine. The road to Nijmegen stretched ahead like a promise that might never be fulfilled, while behind German lines, the sound of tracked vehicles moving through the darkness suggested that students' defensive preparations were far from complete. The Dutch countryside settled into an uneasy twilight, punctuated by the flash of artillery and the distant chatter of machine guns. Somewhere in that darkness, thousands of Allied soldiers prepared for another night of fighting, while their commanders studied maps and wondered if Montgomery's bridge too far might prove to be exactly that. And Nijmegen's prize, a bridge too late. As dawn broke on September the 20th, the ancient city of Nijmegen awakened to the sound of approaching battle. The Waal River curved through the Dutch landscape like a silver ribbon, its waters carrying the weight of history. And soon, the hopes of an entire military operation. The great road bridge that spanned these waters had become more than steel and concrete. It was now the fulcrum upon which Operation Market Garden would either succeed or fail. The 82nd Airborne Division had been fighting for 3 days to secure this vital crossing. Their paratroopers, scattered across the Nijmegen salient, had discovered what their intelligence officers had failed to predict: that the Germans would defend every street, every building, every inch of Dutch soil with a ferocity born of desperation. The Wehrmacht and SS units knew, perhaps better than the Allies themselves, that losing this bridge would open the door to the Ruhr Valley and the heart of the Reich. General James Gavin's men had established a precarious foothold in the southern approaches to Nijmegen, but the bridge itself remained tantalizingly out of reach. German machine gun nests commanded the approaches from concrete bunkers built into the medieval city's foundations. Panzerfausts turned narrow streets into killing zones. Every advance was measured not in miles or kilometers, but in city blocks, purchased with blood. The tactical situation had grown increasingly complex. While XXX Corps continued its grinding advance up Hell's Highway, the delays were mounting like compound interest on an overdue debt. Each hour that passed meant fewer options for the men trapped at Arnhem Bridge, 20 kilometers to the north. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's paratroopers were still holding their positions at the northern end of that distant span, but their ammunition was running low, their casualties mounting, their radio calls growing more desperate with each transmission. In Nijmegen's ancient streets, American paratroopers moved with the careful precision of urban warfare veterans, though many were fighting in a city for the first time. They learned quickly that the rules of combat changed when buildings became fortresses and every window might conceal a sniper's rifle. The Germans had turned the approaches to the bridge into a maze of interlocking fields of fire, forcing the attackers to pay for every yard of progress. Captain Karl Kappel's H Company pushed through the rubble-strewn streets toward the traffic circle that controlled access to the bridge. Behind them, the supporting fire of British tanks provided a steady percussion of high-explosive shells. But even these could not dislodge every defender from every position. The Germans fought with the skill of veterans and the desperation of men who knew that retreat meant the loss of their homeland. The civilians of Nijmegen had become unwilling witnesses to this urban battle. Families huddled in cellars and basements, listening to the sound of combat echoing through their streets. Some had welcomed the Allied paratroopers as liberators. Others had learned to fear any uniform, knowing that occupation and liberation often looked remarkably similar when viewed through the eyes of those caught in between. As the morning wore on, a daring plan began to take shape in the minds of Allied commanders. If the bridge could not be taken by direct assault from the south, perhaps it could be captured by a flanking maneuver across the river itself. The Waal, nearly 400 meters wide at this point, presented its own challenges. But it also offered an opportunity to catch the German defenders by surprise. The plan called for elements of the 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, to cross the Vaal in small boats, then assault the northern end of the bridge while their comrades attacked from the south. It was the kind of operation that looked elegant on paper and terrifying in reality. The paratroopers would be crossing open water under enemy fire, with nowhere to take cover and no possibility of retreat once committed. 26 canvas boats, hastily requisitioned from British engineers, would carry these men across waters that had witnessed centuries of Dutch history. The Vaal had seen Roman legions and medieval armies, Spanish conquistadors and French revolutionaries. Now it would witness American paratroopers attempting one of the most audacious river crossings in military history. Major Julian Cook, commanding the assault force, gathered his men near the riverbank as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. These soldiers had already proven themselves in Normandy and across France, but this mission would test them in ways they had never experienced. They would be paddling canvas boats across a wide river while German machine guns tracked their progress from prepared positions on the far shore. The first boats pushed off from the southern bank at 1500 hours, their occupants paddling with desperate efficiency across the dark waters of the Vaal. German defenders, caught by surprise at the audacity of the assault, initially hesitated, then opened fire with everything they possessed. Machine guns chattered from the northern embankment. Mortars began dropping shells into the river itself, sending geysers of water and shrapnel across the crossing site. Some boats made it across, others did not. The Vaal claimed its share of American paratroopers that afternoon, their bodies carried downstream by currents that cared nothing for national boundaries or military objectives. But enough men reached the northern shore to establish a foothold, and from that foothold they began the methodical work of eliminating German positions one by one. The attack from the north, combined with renewed pressure from the south, finally broke German resistance. By late afternoon, American paratroopers were fighting their way across the Great Span itself, using the bridge's steel girders as cover, while they advanced toward the northern approaches. The sound of their combat boots on the bridge deck echoed across the Vaal like a metallic drumbeat, the rhythm of victory purchased at enormous cost. When the shooting finally stopped, when the last German defender had been killed or captured, the Great Bridge at Nijmegen stood in Allied hands. It was a magnificent achievement, a testament to the courage and determination of soldiers who had accomplished what many thought impossible. The stars and stripes flew from the northern tower, visible for miles across the flat Dutch countryside. But even as the paratroopers celebrated their hard-won victory, troubling news was filtering down from Arnhem. Radio contact with Frost's men at the bridge had been lost. Reconnaissance flights reported heavy German activity throughout the Arnhem area. The relief force that was supposed to reach the British 1st Airborne Division within 48 hours was now 3 days behind schedule, and still 20 kilometers away. The bridge at Nijmegen had become a symbol of both triumph and tragedy. It represented everything that Allied soldiers could accomplish when called upon to perform the impossible, but it also highlighted the cruel mathematics of military logistics. Every hour of delay, every tactical setback, every unforeseen complication had accumulated into a strategic crisis that no amount of individual heroism could solve. As evening approached, the Vaal continued its ancient journey toward the sea, its waters reflecting the steel spans of the captured bridge. The river had witnessed another chapter in the long history of human conflict, another moment when young men had died for objectives they might not fully understand but believed in nonetheless. The prize had been won. But at what cost? And perhaps too late to matter. In the gathering darkness, Allied commanders studied their maps and wondered if Montgomery's bold gamble was already lost, despite the courage of men who had given everything asked of them and more. The Angel of Arnhem, a beacon of hope. While the fighting raged at Nijmegen, 60 miles to the north, another kind of battle was being fought in the quiet suburb of Oosterbeek. Here, where neat Dutch homes lined tree-shaded streets, the remnants of the British 1st Airborne Division had established their final defensive perimeter around the Hartenstein Hotel. But it was not in the hotel itself that the most profound acts of courage were taking place. It was in a modest white house on Benedendorpsweg, where a 38-year-old mother of 5 had transformed her home into something approaching a miracle. Kate ter Horst had awakened on September 17th to the thunder of aircraft overhead. watching in wonder as hundreds of parachutes blossomed across the Dutch countryside. Like most of her countrymen, she had felt her heart leap with hope. Liberation at last, after 4 years of occupation. But as the hours passed and the sounds of battle drew closer, hope gave way to something more immediate: the desperate need to help. The first wounded soldier had appeared at her door on the second day. A young British paratrooper, barely conscious, his uniform torn and bloodied. Kate ter Horst did not hesitate. She helped him inside, cleared her dining room table, and began to tend his wounds with whatever medical supplies she could find. She had no formal training as a nurse, only the instincts of a mother and the deep conviction that human suffering must be answered with human compassion. By the third day, her house had become an unofficial aid station. Word had somehow spread among the scattered paratroopers that the woman in the White House would turn no one away. They came in growing numbers, carried by their comrades, crawling through gardens, stumbling through her front door, with wounds that spoke of the terrible intensity of the fighting in Arnhem. Kate's husband, Jan, had been away when the battle began. She faced this overwhelming responsibility alone, with only her children and an elderly maid to help. Yet somehow, impossibly, she managed. Her dining room became an operating theatre, her sitting room filled with stretchers improvised from doors and planks. Every bedroom, every corner of available space was given over to the wounded. The house itself began to bear the scars of war. German artillery, seeking to suppress the British positions, sent shells screaming overhead. Windows shattered from the concussion of nearby explosions. Shrapnel scarred the walls. Yet Kate ter Horst continued her work, moving calmly among the wounded even as the battle raged around them. She had no morphine to ease their pain, no proper surgical instruments, no antibiotics to fight infection. What she had was something perhaps more precious: an inexhaustible well of human kindness. She held the hands of dying boys who cried out for their mothers. She wrote down final messages for wives and sweethearts they would never see again. She read to them from her Bible, her voice steady and comforting, even when the walls shook from artillery fire. The wounded soldiers, hardened paratroopers who had jumped into hell itself, began calling her the Angel of Arnhem. They had seen the worst that war could offer: the casual brutality, the random cruelty, the way conflict stripped away everything decent and human. Yet here, in this modest Dutch home, they found something that restored their faith, proof that goodness could survive even in the darkest of times. As the days passed and the British perimeter contracted under relentless German pressure, more wounded found their way to Kate's door. Soon, nearly 60 men lay in her house, some with wounds so severe that she knew they would not survive, others clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. She moved among them like a guardian spirit, offering water to the thirsty, adjusting bandages, speaking words of comfort in her careful English. The children helped as they could. Her eldest daughter, barely 12 years old, carried water and helped change dressings. Her younger children, perhaps not fully understanding the gravity of what was happening, brought small gifts to the soldiers. Drawings they had made, flowers picked from the garden, simple tokens that somehow carried the weight of profound meaning. Food became desperately scarce as the battle continued. Kate shared what little she had, often going without herself to ensure the wounded had something to sustain them. Water had to be collected from puddles and shell craters when the pipes were cut by shrapnel. Medical supplies dwindled to nothing, forcing her to tear up sheets and clothing for bandages. Yet through it all, she maintained an atmosphere of calm that seemed almost supernatural. Witnesses would later describe how her presence alone seemed to ease suffering, how her quiet strength gave courage to men who had lost all hope. In the midst of one of the war's most brutal battles, she had created a sanctuary, a place where the human spirit could endure and even triumph over the machinery of destruction. On the night of September 25th, as the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division prepared for their desperate evacuation across the Rhine, Kate ter Horst faced perhaps her greatest challenge. Many of the wounded in her care were too severely injured to be moved. They would have to be left behind when the British withdrew. Abandoned to an uncertain fate under German occupation, she made her choice without hesitation. She would stay with them, these broken young men who had come so far to liberate her country. She would remain at her post until the end, whatever that end might bring. As the sounds of the British withdrawal faded into the night, she continued her vigil, a solitary figure moving through rooms filled with wounded soldiers, carrying a small lamp that seemed to push back not just the darkness, but despair itself. The German forces that occupied Oosterbeek the next morning found a scene that would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. In the White House on Benedendorpsweg, they discovered Kate de Horst still tending to the wounded, still offering comfort to enemy soldiers who could no longer fight. Even hardened Wehrmacht officers were moved by what they witnessed, this quiet demonstration of a humanity that transcended nationality and uniform. The Angel of Arnhem had shown that even in war's darkest moments, compassion could survive, that individual acts of courage and kindness could illuminate the deepest shadows. Her house had become more than a medical station. It had become a testament to the enduring power of human decency, a reminder that the true victory in any conflict belongs not to those who can destroy, but to those who choose to heal. In the gathering twilight of Operation Market Garden's failure, Kate de Horst's courage shone like a beacon, proof that some battles are won not with weapons, but with love, and that some victories echo through history long after the guns have fallen silent. Arnhem's fall, isolation and despair. As Kate de Horst's sanctuary provided its fragile comfort in Oosterbeek, the broader tragedy of Operation Market Garden was reaching its inevitable conclusion. The British 1st Airborne Division, once 10,000 strong, now found itself compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter, their ammunition dwindling, their hope fading like autumn light through the shattered trees of the Dutch countryside. By September 22nd, the 5th day of what was meant to be a swift operation, Colonel John Frost's men at Arnhem Bridge had been overwhelmed. The northern end of the bridge, held with such determination for 4 days and nights, finally fell silent. The paratroopers who had fought with such tenacity were either dead, wounded, or captured, their sacrifice measured not in ground gained, but in time bought for their comrades retreating toward the Rhine. The remnants of the division now clung to a narrow strip of land near Oosterbeek, their backs to the river that had become both barrier and lifeline. This pocket, barely 3 miles wide and 2 miles deep, contained what remained of Britain's elite airborne force. Men who had jumped into Holland with the confidence of liberators, now reduced to desperate defenders in a battle they could not win. General Urquhart moved through his contracting perimeter like a ghost of command. The radio sets that might have coordinated his defense lay scattered and useless, victims of German jamming and the wrong frequencies that had plagued the operation from its first hours. Without reliable communication, his battalions fought as isolated islands, each company commander making decisions in the terrible solitude of command, never knowing if help might come or if surrender was the only mercy left to offer his men. The supply situation had become catastrophic. RAF transport aircraft continued their brave attempts to resupply the division, but German flak and fighter aircraft turned each mission into a deadly gamble. The colorful parachutes that did reach the ground often drifted into German-held territory, their precious cargo of ammunition, medical supplies, and food becoming gifts to the enemy rather than salvation for the surrounded paratroopers. In the woods around Oosterbeek, men who had once moved with the precision of elite soldiers now scavenged like desperate animals. They collected rainwater in their helmets, shared single cigarettes among entire sections, and counted their remaining ammunition by individual rounds rather than magazines. The magnificent airborne red berets, once worn with such pride, were often discarded in favor of German helmets, practical protection being more valuable than regimental tradition when survival hung by such slender threads. The German response had evolved from surprised resistance into methodical destruction. SS Oberfuhrer Harz's forces, reinforced by elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, now possessed overwhelming superiority in both numbers and firepower. They brought up artillery pieces and mortars, turning the wooded perimeter into a killing ground where every tree might hide death and every movement invited destruction. Yet even in this desperate hour, the paratroopers maintained the discipline that had made them legendary. They shared their meager rations without complaint, tended their wounded with infinite care, and continued to fight with a professionalism that impressed even their German opponents. When ammunition ran low, they fought with captured weapons. When those failed, they fought with grenades and bayonets. And when all else was exhausted, They fought with the quiet courage of men who refused to surrender their honor even when victory had become impossible. The civilians of Oosterbeek found themselves trapped between two armies, their homes becoming fortresses and their gardens becoming battlefields. Many, like Kate Terhorst, opened their doors to wounded soldiers regardless of uniform, understanding that in war's final accounting, suffering recognizes no nationality. Others huddled in their cellars, listening to the sounds of battle overhead and wondering if they would survive to see another dawn. As September 23rd dawned grey and cold, the situation had become untenable. German forces were systematically reducing the perimeter, using tanks and self-propelled guns to destroy British positions one by one. The morning mist that had once concealed Allied movements now seemed to carry the scent of defeat. A bitter mixture of cordite, smoke, and the earthy smell of freshly turned soil where shells had torn the peaceful Dutch countryside apart. Lieutenant Colonel Graham Warwick, the division's chief medical officer, worked tirelessly in aid stations that changed location hourly as the perimeter contracted. His medical teams performed surgery by candlelight in bombed-out houses, operated on kitchen tables, and used bedsheets for bandages when proper medical supplies were exhausted. They saved lives with improvised tools and boundless determination, proving that healing, like courage, finds a way even in the darkest circumstances. The paratroopers began to speak in whispers of evacuation, though the word felt like betrayal on their tongues. These were men trained never to retreat, soldiers whose doctrine emphasized holding ground at any cost. Yet reality had become undeniable. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from any hope of relief. XXX Corps remained stalled south of the Rhine, unable to force a crossing in the face of determined German resistance. In London, Churchill received the reports with growing dismay. The operation he had supported, despite his reservations about Montgomery's optimism, was clearly failing. The strategic prize of a quick end to the war was slipping away, replaced by the bitter taste of another costly lesson in the dangers of underestimating a determined enemy fighting on familiar ground. As darkness fell on September 24th, the 8th day of Operation Market Garden, the men of the 1st Airborne Division prepared for what many sensed might be their final night on Dutch soil. They cleaned their weapons with practiced efficiency, wrote letters they hoped might somehow reach home, and settled into positions they would defend until death or capture claimed them. The forest around Oosterbeek had become their cathedral, a place where ordinary men discovered extraordinary reserves of courage, where the bonds of brotherhood proved stronger than the fear of death. In this shrinking pocket of resistance, surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces, they had found something that victory alone could never provide. The knowledge that they had given everything they possessed in service to something greater than themselves. Retreat and reflection, a bitter end. The knowledge would have to sustain them through what came next. For on September 25th, 8 days after the operation began, Montgomery finally acknowledged what his field commanders had known for days. Operation Market Garden was over. The decision came not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet admission of reality. In his headquarters, studying the same maps that had once promised such brilliant success, Montgomery faced the arithmetic of failure. The 1st Airborne Division had ceased to exist as a fighting force. XXX Corps remained stalled south of the Rhine. The bridge at Arnhem, that vital crossing that would have opened the door to Germany itself, remained firmly in German hands. The withdrawal began under cover of darkness on September 25th. Operation Berlin, they called it, a name that carried its own bitter irony. British and Canadian boats slipped across the dark waters of the Rhine, their engines muffled, their crews navigating by whispered directions and the faint phosphorescence of the current. Of the 10,000 men who had landed north of the Rhine 8 days earlier, fewer than 2,400 would make it back across that black water. They came in small groups, hollow-eyed paratroopers who had held impossible positions with dwindling ammunition, sappers who had fought as infantry, medics who had performed miracles in cellars and ruins. Each man who stumbled into those rescue boats carried with him the weight of those who would not be coming home. The evacuation boats moved like ghosts across the Rhine, that ancient river that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that had seen Caesar's legions and Napoleon's Grande Armée. Now it bore witness to another chapter in the long story of human ambition meeting immutable reality. The paratroopers who made it across often spoke little of what they had endured. Some things, they had learned, existed beyond the reach of words. Behind them, in the forests and streets of Oosterbeek, they left more than equipment and positions. Scattered across the battlefield lay the remnants of the most ambitious airborne operation ever attempted. Abandoned Bren guns rested where their crews had fallen. Empty ammunition boxes marked final stands. Parachutes hung like funeral shrouds from the trees that had witnessed such courage and such loss. The German forces who moved through these positions in the days that followed found something that statistics could never capture. They discovered foxholes where single paratroopers had held off entire squads. They found aid stations where British medics had treated German wounded alongside their own men. They uncovered defensive positions that revealed the methodical professionalism of soldiers who had fought on long past any reasonable hope of survival. General Student himself, the architect of Germany's defensive success, would later write that he had never encountered troops who fought with such tenacious courage in such hopeless circumstances. Even in victory, he recognized something that transcended the mere mechanics of warfare, the transformation of ordinary men into something approaching the mythic. For the Dutch civilians who had witnessed this drama unfold in their streets and gardens, the aftermath brought its own complex emotions. They had welcomed the paratroopers as liberators, had shared their food, their water, their homes. Kate ter Horst and countless others had risked everything to help these young men from across the sea. Now they watched German forces reassert control, knowing that their acts of kindness would not be forgotten or forgiven. The price of hope, they learned, could be measured in more than military casualties. It could be counted in the deportations that followed, in the reprisals against those who had dared to believe that liberation was at hand. The failure of Market Garden condemned much of the Netherlands to another winter of occupation, a winter that would prove to be among the harshest in memory. Yet something had been planted in those September days that would outlive the immediate tactical failure. The Dutch had seen that the German war machine, for all its recent resurgence, was not invincible. They had witnessed courage that reminded them that freedom, however delayed, remained possible. The paratroopers had given them something more valuable than early liberation. They had given them proof that some things were worth any sacrifice. In London, Churchill absorbed the reports with characteristic stoicism. The Prime Minister understood that Market Garden's failure meant more than tactical disappointment. It meant that the war would continue through another winter, that the final victory would exact an even higher price in blood and treasure. The quick end that had seemed so tantalizingly possible in those heady days of August was now revealed as an illusion. The strategic implications rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. The German forces that had contained Market Garden would now be available for other sectors. The supplies that had been concentrated for this single thrust could not be easily redistributed. Most critically, the window of opportunity that had opened with the collapse of German resistance in France had now definitively closed. As autumn deepened across Europe, the abandoned positions around Arnhem began their slow return to nature. Rain filled the foxholes, leaves covered the scattered equipment. The forest reclaimed what men had briefly contested with such desperate intensity. But the memory remained, of ordinary men who had discovered extraordinary courage, of a plan that had dared greatly even in failure, of a bridge that had become a symbol of the price that freedom demands from each generation. And epilogue, a peaceful dawn. As autumn deepened across Europe, the abandoned positions around Arnhem began their slow return to nature. Rain filled the foxholes, leaves covered the scattered equipment, the forest reclaimed what men had briefly contested with such desperate intensity, but the memory remained, of ordinary men who had discovered extraordinary courage, of a plan that had dared greatly even in failure, of a bridge that had become a symbol of the price that freedom demands from each generation. In the months that followed, Dutch families would return to their homes in Oosterbeek, sweeping away the debris of battle, replanting gardens that had been churned by tank tracks and artillery shells. Children who had hidden in cellars during those September days would grow up hearing stories of the men who had fallen from the sky, stories that would be passed down through generations like sacred trust. The strategic lessons of Market Garden would be studied in staff colleges for decades to come. Military historians would debate Montgomery's boldness, Eisenhower's approval, the intelligence failures that had placed two SS Panzer divisions directly in the path of the airborne assault. They would analyze the logistics, the communications breakdowns, the weather delays that had scattered the drops across the Dutch countryside like seeds on uncertain ground. But beyond the tactical analyses and strategic assessments lay something deeper, something that could not be quantified in after-action reports or measured by territorial gains and losses. It was the understanding that in those 9 days, ordinary human beings had been asked to perform extraordinary acts, and had done so without hesitation, without reservation, without thought for their own survival. The bridge at Arnhem still spans the Rhine today, rebuilt from the rubble of war, carrying peaceful traffic between towns that once echoed with the sound of battle. Tourists pause on its span, reading memorial plaques that attempt to capture in bronze and stone what can never truly be captured. The moment when history pivoted on the courage of individuals who could not have known they were making history at all. Kate ter Horst's house in Oosterbeek became a place of pilgrimage for the families of those she had comforted in their final hours. They came from Britain and Poland, from America and Canada, seeking some connection to sons and fathers and brothers who had died so far from home. She would welcome them with the same quiet grace she had shown to wounded paratroopers, understanding that grief, like courage, transcends all boundaries of nationality and language. The fields where gliders had crash-landed were replanted with crops that would feed the living. The drop zones where parachutes had blossomed like deadly flowers returned to pasture. Farmers working their land would occasionally unearth remnants of that September week. A helmet, a rifle, fragments of equipment that spoke of desperate hours when the fate of nations had hung in the balance. As evening settles across the Dutch countryside now, decades removed from those events, the landscape holds a profound peace. The same rivers flow toward the sea. The same ancient forests whisper in the wind. But something has changed in the quality of that peace. It has been purchased, earned through sacrifice, made sacred by the blood of those who believed that some things are worth dying for. The sun sets behind the same trees that once provided cover for snipers and machine gun nests, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that echo the colors of autumn leaves and distant fires. Children play in fields where paratroopers once fought house to house, their laughter carrying on the same wind that once carried the sound of artillery and the cries of wounded men calling for medics who could not reach them. In the growing twilight, the ghosts of September 1944 seem almost visible. Shadows moving between the trees, figures crossing bridges that exist now only in memory, voices calling across the years with messages of courage and sacrifice that each generation must learn to hear anew. The strategic failure of Operation Market Garden had become something greater than its tactical objectives. It had become a testament to the human capacity for heroism in the face of impossible odds. A reminder that victory and defeat are measured not only in territory gained or lost, but in the courage displayed when everything depends on ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things. And so the peaceful dawn breaks over Arnhem and Nijmegen, over Eindhoven and Oosterbeek, over the countless small towns and villages where the echoes of that September still resonate in the collective memory of a grateful continent, carrying forward through the generations the understanding that freedom is not free, that peace must be earned, and that the price paid by those who came before must never be forgotten by those who inherit the world they died to preserve.